many cool LEGO Formula 1 sets for the different cars and teams, but we never see anything from those who are actually behind the wheel. So today I wanted to change that by making builds for every single driver on the 2025 grid. If you didn't know, Formula 1 has 10 different teams, each with 2 drivers, which means I'm gonna have to make 10 different bodies and 20 different heads in order to have an entire grid. So I figured the best way to do this is by turning each of them into their very own LEGO brickheads. Starting off with Alpine, I created the race suit following the standard brickheads formula and utilized some sideways building techniques in order to include the pink of the suit. The hair is where I think I'm gonna struggle with the most as I make these builds, since there's a pretty limited part selection that will work well for hair and many drivers share similar hairstyles. For Franco, I focused on making it look scruffy and curly using a lot of slopes, whereas for Pierre, I used a combination of slopes and curves in order to try and match his current look. Since all brickheads share the same fundamentals, there was a lot of crossover in terms of parts and building techniques across each of the different teams. The first are the legs, which are always 1 brick or 3 plates high, the thigh, which is represented usually by a 2x4 plate, and the base of the body, which is a 4x4 plate. The rest of the body's design depends on each suit, which in the case of the Haas, I actually had to stray away from these proportions just a little bit in order to get the body and the arms to work. However, the difference on this is super minimal and it was well worth it in order to get the correct Haas colors as well as the logo on the torso. For Ollie, I kept his hair smooth at the back and the sides and then used a lot of slopes on the top to give him the messiness and height that he has. When it came to Esteban, I took a similar approach, but instead of slopes, I ended up using these curved pieces so that his hair looked a lot more curly, matching his real life hair closer. Surprisingly, one of the more complicated suits to make was that of Kick Sauber. Just like in the F1 car LEGO sets, I wanted the color of the green to be different from that of Aston Martin, so I ended up going for the exact same bright green as in this model. However, using this color introduced a lot more restrictions since there aren't as many pieces that exist in it. The Sauber suit also has a lot of super interesting lines, which I thought would be best represented by the 1x1 cheese slope. However, that would require me attaching one of them completely upside down. I experimented with a couple of different techniques and pieces on a digital software before landing on using a mix of brackets and plates, which attached to the build of Nico and Gabby's face. For Gabby, I used medium tan so that his complexion matched closer to him in real life, and used the same curves pieces as Esteban to create his curly hair. For Nico, I tried to keep the sides as short as possible to represent his really smooth fade, focusing more on the build of his hair at the top. Then for Aston Martin, I used the more classic green just like in their LEGO model. This suit by far was the easiest to design because I ended up using a bunch of simple brick thanks to its really simple design. I incorporated the logos with some really easy brickwork and then began to work on Alonso and Stroll's faces. For Fernando, since he has a relatively prominent beard, I ended up tiling off the bottom and sides of his face. I then tried to replicate his big quiff by using a lot of height through slopes and brick. For Lance, on the other hand, he looks a lot simpler with some super spiky hair with some slopes and wedges. Another really difficult suit to replicate was that of the Visa Cash App RB team. Since their 2025 suit has some green accents and a lot of very prominent sponsors, I found it really difficult to consolidate that into such a small format. I started with the legs, and instead of using bricks or plates, I ended up using a 2x2 bracket piece with plates and tiles in order to make the outside blue stripe of their legs. This worked really well and allowed me to get a lot of extra detail in, so I took a similar approach for the body. And this allowed me to incorporate a lot of the sponsors' colors on both the front and back of the suits, which I wouldn't have been able to do without the bracket pieces. For Liam's hair, I kept it short and spiky, and then for Isaac, I shortened the back by 1 stud and focused on having a very smooth look with a couple of slopes mixed in to act as some stray hairs. To create the suits for Williams, I once again had to stray away from the classic brickheads format in order to make sure that their suit legs looked accurate. I ended up having to use a variety of bricks and plates in order to get these blue stripes to run all the way up the side of the Williams suit. To continue this, I then added some brackets onto the body and filled up the middle with a bunch of various plates in order to represent the different sponsors. The most intimidating part though was trying to get the hair of both Alex and Carlos Sainz. For Alex, I ended up using medium tan for his face and then built up his hair using primarily curved slope pieces, using a couple of regular slopes as scruffy accents on his head. Carlos was a much bigger challenge, however, because he is known for his beautiful hair. I started by adding a strand of hair to his face before using some wedge plates to help build up the side of his hair. For him, I ended up using a lot of really long curved slopes, mixing in a few classic cheese slopes and quarter tiles for some added texture. They both came together super well, and I am very happy with how Carlos's hair turned out. Much like V-Carb Williams, I ended up using bracket pieces in order to build up the body of the Red Bull suits. This allowed me to build up the classic Red Bull logo right in the center of the body of the brickheads. Like Alex, I used medium tan for Yuki and a lot of the same piece types and techniques when it came to designing his hair, just in a very different format. Yuki, however, features a lot more black wedge plates to make his hair hair look much more spiky in order to match him in real life. For Max, on the other hand, I went with a very different approach in order to make his hair look a lot smoother and cleaner. He has one of the least textured builds when it comes to his hair, which I really feel like plays into his hairstyle and works really well with these dark tan pieces. Then thanks to the LEGO Speed Champions line, there is actually a 1x1 red plate that exists with a tiny little Ferrari logo printed on the side. And I thought this was going to be absolutely perfect for the Ferrari suit build. I used some modified bricks and some jumper tiles in order to get that awfully big, obnoxious HP logo in there, and then still was able to build up the sides a little bit so that I could include that Ferrari logo printed tile. The entire suit was pretty simple, which meant I had way more time to focus on trying to build Charles and Lewis's face. I started with Lewis because I thought his would be a little bit harder to figure out. I gave him a beard, although since his is really light and faint in real life, the thickness of the LEGO version just doesn't look as good as it did as the minifigure version of him that I made a few weeks ago. I then used large curved slopes all around the sides of his head, except for at the very back, which I built up using a bunch of these round curved pieces in order to try and replicate his braids. And whilst I feel like this brickhead definitely does represent Lewis, he is very far from perfect in my eyes. For Charles, I skipped the facial hair entirely and just focused on his haircut, which is quite spiky and scruffy looking. I stacked slopes and curves in order to try and give him a lot of shape and height, whilst also trying to have things stay relatively neat, which I think ended up working quite well. On the more simpler side of things, we have the Mercedes race suit, which is very similar to the Aston Martin, as I was able to pretty much build out the entire thing using basic brick and plates. I ended up making two versions of this race suit though, because much like Ferrari, Mercedes actually has a printed logo tile that I really wanted to try and include on the front. Personally, I think the version with the printed tile works a lot better, but in this case, I'm going to use the one with the printed tile for George and use the basic suit for Kimi. Kimi was the most fun out of these two to recreate since his hair has so much volume and texture to it. I almost exclusively used wedges and cheese slopes to make his hair, and I think it looks pretty much perfect. I found George a little bit harder to make because of his Prince Charming-esque hair, however, I still feel like it worked. Unlike Kimi, I went for a much smoother and neater approach when it came to George's hair, and when you put the two of them side by side, I think they look really good. And finally, we have my favorite team and the ones that I feel like the builds turned out the absolute best on, which is none other than McLaren. Now, don't get me wrong, the Hop of High rules thing is absolutely doing my head in, but team drama aside, I think these builds turned out absolutely perfect. Their simple and clean suit translates so well into LEGO, and I was able to create the orange and black divide using some basic sloped bricks. For Lando, I kept things very simple, just pretty much building up his entire head using cheese slope pieces facing various directions. I kept them very close to his head, and overall I think it turned out absolutely great. And I also went for a medium tan skin tone with him, which I feel like makes him look a lot more accurate again than the minifigure version of him did. However, Oscar is by far the best and most accurate looking of all. I used some of the Cedric Diggory brickheads as inspiration in order to try and get the style of his hair, which I feel like really played into Oscar's favor. It helped massively when designing his signature curl, which I really feel like is the thing that ties this build together. However, I had to modify my original design slightly due to how rare this wedge plate is in dark brown, but it worked out so well, all things considered. And with McLaren all done, the lineup is complete and they are ready to race. These brickheads were such a fun project, and representing the sponsors without printed pieces was such a fun challenge. I'm really looking forward to seeing the updated suits for the 2026 season, and if you want to build any of these models yourself, the instructions are available on HollyOnFilm.com. Thanks so much for watching, consider subscribing, and if you want to make all of the drivers as minifigures, check out the video on the end screen now.